is called fiscal policy, and I'm going to tell you about that a little bit later. And the other one is called monetary policy. And the monetary policy, making the economy work better, is the job of the central bank. Let me say that again. For a long time, the government, that's what the Federal Reserve is, has to manage the economy. Everybody who learns economics learns that. Everybody who practices economic policy in Washington knows it. However, on ceremonial occasions, you're supposed to act as though the government either doesn't do that or doesn't do it well. It's a very strange country we live in. Monetary policy, the government's supposed to manipulate the money system. One of the ways it does that, and that's what the Federal Reserve just did, is when things really looking bad, lots of people out of work, is you flood the system with money. And here the idea is not complicated. It's simple. It says, if you put a lot of money in a lot of people's pockets, they'll spend it. Economics pretends to be a very deep subject. It isn't. Like all subjects that have learned how to cope with capitalism, we in economics have done what the lawyers did. Lawyers took very simple ideas, developed a language that would make it impossible for you to understand it, wrote it up in that language, and then charged you to translate it back to the simple idea it originally was. And we do the same thing in economics. So the problem of the economy is there's not enough happening. Give people more money. And since the government has the monopoly, the government prints it. I want to make this clear to you. Okay? The Federal Reserve prints the money, literally makes the money, either by physically making a bill or just putting an entry in an account somewhere that says something has more money in its account than it did yesterday. Okay? That's what the Federal Reserve does. Is there any limit to what the Federal Reserve does? No. Is it constrained in the amount of money it produces by, say, the quantity of gold in Fort Knox? No. It's just a group of guys, and a couple of women, of course, for decoration. It is a group of guys led by Benjamin Bernanke. They have a meeting, and they decide the economy don't look so good. Let's produce more money and throw it in there. And they decide that, and then having decided, let's do it, then they decide how much. And it's just what they think the situation needs. They can print as much as they want. Do they need to get Congress's approval? No. Do they need to get the president's approval? No. Do they need to get the Supreme Court's approval? No. Do they need to get your approval? No. They're the authority. They do it. And they decided to pump $600 billion into the American economy starting last week. And to do it over the next few weeks. I don't know exactly how long the period is, but for a while, they don't do it all at once. They pump the money in. Okay, this is remarkable. We're now going to have a lot more money. What is the goal of this money? Well, I've already told you. It's to stimulate the economy. If there's more money around, let's say starting with banks, if they're flush with more money, they're hopefully going to be more liberal about lending it out. Yeah. That's the idea. See, they're going to come to you and say, well, we're loaded with this money. Wouldn't you like to have a loan, improve your house, buy a car, something? And they're supposed to go to businesses and say, well, there's all this money here. Here's a loan. And the Federal Reserve, which also controls not just the money supply, but also controls lots of interest rates, not all of them, but a lot of them, has also taken the step, as you know, to boost our seriously depressed economy by bringing down interest rates to record lows. Half of 1%, 1%, very low interest rates. Let's recoup that. We're trying to stimulate the economy by making borrowing cheaper than ever and flooding new money that can be lent at these cheap rates. So the whole idea is to stimulate borrowing and spending. So, what's the problem? Isn't this a good idea? Doesn't it make sense?
No, it's how we got into this.
Well, careful. Let's go step by step. It makes a certain sense. It could work. Here's how it could work. Here's the idea. If the loan is cheap to get, because the interest rate is low, and there's lots more money being produced by the monopoly government power that does it, then maybe the lending will take place. The businesses and individuals that borrow will take the money and go out and buy things. New houses, new cars, new clothes, new vacations, whatever. And as the businessmen and women who make all the things that people will buy with the new money that they've borrowed, as they see all the customers coming with the money that they've gotten from the government, they'll hire lots of people. They'll hire them to make all the extra stuff they can now sell to all the people who borrowed at the low interest all the new money from the government. Is that possible? Sure it is. That's the hope. That's the dream. Because then millions of people will get jobs again, making all the stuff that the people who borrow the money that the government is printing can spend. And it'll work. We'll overcome unemployment. The economy will get going again. And we'll all hold each other's hands and walk off into the sunset by the beach with Medea. That's what we'll do. Is that possible? Sure it is. That's the hope. But it's capitalism. So it turns out things could go wrong. And here's the one most important for you to keep in your mind. When the government pumps all this money in, gives people more money, and lowers the interest rate so everybody can borrow from any bank all this extra money, and then let's suppose people do and businesses do. Step one, that's good. And then they got running to the stores and start buying stuff, and the businesses everywhere see the purchasing power being used. Because it's a private capitalist system, all these businesses have the following option. As they see all of you with your fresh new loans coming to the store to buy, they have a choice they can make. They can order more stuff to sell to you as you all come in with more money to spend. Or, seeing you all with more money, they can decide, jack the price up. Because you got the money. And you know, it's a lot more profitable to not bother with ordering stuff that might get left on the shelf. If all these people are coming in, you know they're going to compete with one another for what's in your store. Why should you order more stuff? Just raise the price. Soak up all that money by making everything cost more. And if there are other reasons anyway why you might want to raise prices, all the more likely. So the risk of what the Federal Reserve has already done and what it is now committed to doing more of could produce a massive increase in prices, known as an inflation. That's what the word means, when prices generally go up. Why? Because we have enormously, in this crisis, starting in 2008, boosted the amount of money. It didn't work, by the way, the first time when the Fed did this a year and a half ago. Here's what happened, how it went wrong in a different way. The government printed the money. The government drove down the interest rates. And it poured the money into the banks. And the idea, as I told you, was the banks would now lend it. But they didn't. They just held on. And they held on for a very good reason. They were in deep trouble. Most of our larger banks were basically bankrupt. They were not viable as institutions. And so they saw the government's cheap money as a way for them to rebuild their damaged economic situation. They had lost huge amounts of money. They had made loans irresponsibly, crookedly, and those were never going to get paid back. So they took the money and recouped themselves. And when the government came, particularly with some liberal economists, waved the finger at them. You know, we gave you this money because the idea is, as you know from the classes we teach you, you're supposed to lend it out. And the banks looked at them and said, are you crazy? Lending that money out is what got us into this mess. You've just been scolding us for lending it badly. We're not going to do that again. We're not going to lend to anybody about whom we have the slightest doubt. And we have doubts about nearly everybody. So we're holding it on. We're holding on to it. We don't trust each other. We're holding on. That's one of the reasons more money is now being spent, because the first didn't do the job. We hope this time they'll go out and spend it. But the problem is, if it works, it gets spent, that will solve the problem of having more spending, but it'll raise the awful specter of an inflation, which is a very real problem. Very real. We've had inflations before. Countries coming out of a crisis often have inflations as the next step that comes later. So this is a real problem, and it is a very strange thing when economists who should know better need to pretend that this is some right-wing craziness, this worry about inflation. It shouldn't be. In case you don't know, the last time an advanced industrial country found itself at the wrong end of a long economic crisis was Germany. And its economic crisis came when it had the bad taste to lose World War I. And so the Germans, who were a very powerful capitalist country at that time, come out of the war really wrecked. World War I was not a good war, and it was particularly not a good war to lose. And having lost the war, they then had another experience which was even more troubling. The victorious countries, United States, Britain, France particularly, wanted the Germans as losers to pay the cost of the war for the winners. You know, it's like a legal fight when your lawyer not only gets the other side to pay a fine, but to pay your legal costs too. Well, we had this wonderful Treaty of Versailles and so forth at the end of World War I, and the Germans were punished by having to make a reparations payment. For the next 10 years, they would have to take huge amounts of money and pay the countries that had defeated them in the war to so those